Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profitable Pastures 2022. My name is Terry Noon, and I am the chair of the Ontario Forage Council. This is the first of 3 webinars for this year's virtual conference. If you would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and Christine O'Reilly will share them with the presenter at the end of the talk. Thank you to Beef Farmers of Ontario, Ontario Sheep Farmers, Minto Ag Limited, and SGS Canada Laboratories for their generous partnership of this year's webinar series. So thank you to our sponsors. Today's session is called Planned Grazing, Making the Cows Work for You. Our presenter, Pam Iwanchysko, has been a livestock specialist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development for the past 25 years based in Dauphin, Manitoba. She received her BSA at the University of Manitoba and her Master of Science at the University of Saskatchewan. Her passion for agriculture developed at a very young age, growing up on a mixed operation north of Dauphin. She has continued working in the field with producers one-on-one and has taken many leadership roles in delivering several extension events in Manitoba and Western Canada over the years, including the Manitoba Grazing School and the Western Canadian Holistic Management Conference, to name a few. She currently lives north of Dauphin on an acreage with her husband and 3 children. I would like to pass it over to Pam at this time.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. It's been an honor to be asked to speak to you this evening based on some of the work that we've been doing for the past several years at our Applied Research Station, which is north of Brandon, about 10 minutes north of Brandon. And it used to be what we had called the soil farm, but anyway, it is now a forage and livestock research farm. And so when I had the opportunity to lead a project in terms of a pasture management project and what we've called the Planned Grazing Project, I was more than overjoyed to do so, and have learned a lot of things over the past 6 years in this project. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that today, and basically making the cows work for you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about really basically how I think that good management does have an effect in terms of profitability and sustainability on the farms. Some of the key words that we've spoken about over the years in terms of our extension message to producers here in Manitoba, for sure, and just how they're going hand in hand with some of the things that we've done over the past 6 years at the research farm. I wanted to touch on some of the more important points that I thought we could talk about in terms of the way we developed the project and how we followed through on it. And basically, I wanted to talk a little bit, first of all, about climate change and the role that the forage and cattle play in climate change. And we know that climate change has been associated with things like hotter and colder temperatures, more extreme climatic conditions, increased flooding and droughts. And we've certainly experienced that here in Manitoba over the last several years, as has most of Western Canada and throughout Canada. So I think that, a large portion of that people are seeing as cattle and ruminants on the landscape sort of have become vilified with that regard, in that regard. But I think that it's a misunderstanding, and certainly we know that Dr. Frank Mittler of UC Davis has certainly tried to debunk some of those issues. And if you haven't already followed him, I would encourage you to do so. There has been a lot of research in terms of, that are truly defining what contributions, cattle and ruminant animals make in terms of greenhouse gases. And but I think primarily the message I want to say here is that under good management, they actually can become a solution to the problem more than the villains. So we all know that ruminant livestock have the ability to utilize marginal lands that are not otherwise suited for crop production, and they can produce a really high quality protein on that land for human consumption. So while all in the meantime, they're actually maximizing energy from the sun and, carbon dioxide utilization through the use of those forages on the landscape. So it's really, truly a good news story about having livestock on the landscape, and under proper management techniques, I think it's a win-win situation. We know we get that higher utilization of energy through photosynthesis. We get better land cover, reduced erosion, better water infiltration, enhanced soil microbial populations, increased organic matter, and more resistance against weed and insect infestation. So the role that, there's really lots and lots of positive spin-offs in terms of how keeping livestock on the landscape. And certainly from a soil science perspective, the role that soil microbes are playing in terms of the importance of them on the landscape is just becoming understood. And they really do play an important role in terms of nutrient uptake for the plants to produce that high quality forage that the animals need to produce that high quality protein. So just keep that in mind. It's a really good news story that I really like to comment on when I get the chance and showcase how important having ruminant livestock are. So certainly research and development of livestock production has come a very long way. We know that Canadian beef has one of the lowest greenhouse gas footprints per unit of production in the world on a carbon equivalent per kilogram of live weight basis. And it's less than half of the world average. And that's because of some of those scientific and research development. And also the other thing to keep in mind here is that Canadian grasslands are being preserved when we keep cattle on the landscape. So we aren't cultivating those lands. And in fact, if we don't, then, we can reduce the loss of the soil organic carbons anywhere from 30 to 35% based on what is and has been cultivated. So it's really important to keep these animals on the landscape. We're also learning things like feed additives, good manure management, provides good fertility and nutrients to the soils and ensures those healthy grasslands survivability and sustainability. And we're also keeping that habitat intact. It's protection of that grassland ecosystem that is so important and so threatened at the same time. So in saying all of that, my basic number one message is that we can keep animals on the landscape. They can be profitable to do so, and under good pasture management, it's all possible. So basically some of the research that is out there and is definitely coming to fruition and coming out in terms of being in the forefront is stuff like the adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Lots of research that has been conducted over the years, certainly more coming about. And it's really important that we note that only 10% of the ranchers out there currently use this model. So this model being, high intensity grazing, looking at, utilizing paddocks within their pasture system versus a continuous grazing system. And so this project evolved because of some of that research, and we wanted to conduct some within Manitoba and just showcase the value of putting in a little bit more energy and management into a pasture system, and how much more profitability and productivity would result. So basically, we've come to the conclusion that there was a lot of tools that were out there that weren't necessarily being utilized to the fullest efficiency. First and foremost, when we started developing this plan, for our grazing system here in Manitoba, paddock design was up at the front as how we were going to conduct this applied research demonstration. And so, I was fortunate enough to be able to work with Dr. Terence McGonigal from Brandon University, in which we could utilize data and have it analyzed in a scientific way. We also looked at utilizing some of the newest technology in terms of temporary and permanent fencing that was already there. We looked at developing a water system, and we know that that there's certainly a lot more resources out there in terms of what has happened with temporary electric fencing and solar pumping watering systems. And so the technology has definitely advanced from where it was even, 25, 30 years ago. So it's definitely a lot more user friendly and easier to fix, I would suggest. First and foremost, I guess the biggest thing that or tool that we looked at in this project was rest and recovery. And so all of the findings or all of the research that was out there when we started this project had focused on days rest. And so I had been fortunate enough to go through the holistic management training, where a lot of the forage management is based on rest and recovery. And some of the newest craze in terms of regenerative agriculture also focuses on rest and recovery. It focuses on diversity on the landscape. And so, it's very important to make sure that when you're doing these calculations in terms of how many days the cows are on pasture, the animals are on pasture, that this probably would be the number one thing that you would want to target. It would be something that you would have to keep in mind at all times when you're moving those animals throughout the paddocks. And then another tool that we are using is plant readiness. And we just started this a couple of years ago based on some research that Kathy Voth had done down in the US, and looking at the plant readiness and then also residual management. So in terms of the planned grazing strategy, we want to make sure that we have lots of residual there in the winter to capture the snow and capture the moisture for early spring growth. So these are just some of the very simplistic tools that we have focused our research on, but in my mind, it absolutely has worked, and we are getting some really positive results. So just in terms of our paddock design, this is what we are referred to as the Brookdale Farm, which is north of Brandon. And the rotational grazing, or the planned grazing system, is basically focused in the north half of this the section of the farm. And so where you see the light green or the bright green paddocks, those are the ones where the animals are moved on a daily basis. Those are split up into 1 acre pieces. And then in the red, those are corresponding paddocks with the same amount of acres to the lettered paddocks. So if you see the A paddocks and the B paddocks and the C paddocks, the D, and it goes all the way up to G, those are corresponding to the same species that were in those pastures when we started the project. So they're basically 90 acres each, and we had 25 cow-calf pairs on them for the last 6 years. And the only reason we did have only 25 cow-calf pairs on each is because we were basically just starting up this farm. The intent is to increase the number of cow-calf pairs this year based on the increased carrying capacity that we're seeing. So certainly in terms of, increasing the herd size, it's definitely a bonus when you can see that there's a lot more resilience and a lot more productivity where proper pasture management has taken place. So again, temporary fencing, when I say we move the cows every day on the planned grazing, this is what we are utilizing, is step-in posts and some polywire on a reel. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to set this up. And we've got it down to about 15 minutes a day. And the animals have to be checked on a daily basis anyway on this farm. They are following an animal health protocol, so they are checked regularly as well, and the summer students can just go out there. They typically set the fence up for 3-day moves. So on the 3rd day, they will take the fence down from the first paddock and put it onto the 3rd paddock. So yeah, really easy, and basically anyone can do this sort of thing. I guess the biggest hurdle was getting everything set up in year 1. It was a little bit wet that year, and we did get stuck in certain places of the pasture, but it's true to what every farmer would experience on their own operation. there's a lot of sloughs on this farm, and so a lot of wet, low areas, and it was certainly challenging, but well worth the effort to do that. Water development. In the first year that wasn't part of this project, we actually hauled water to paddocks, and it was trying, to say the least. Again, it was a wet year. That was 7 years ago, and with a truck and trailer, you can easily get stuck in a pasture that has a lot of sloughs. So it wasn't a question as to whether or not we were going to put in a watering system. So the watering system is set up right up here. There is a small little lake, or a very large slough, and so we have a solar powered watering system, and the blue lines are where the overground watering pipe is laid, and then it is accessible from all of these paddocks to get to the watering system. So what you'll see here is how we set up the spigots on where we wanted to set up the waterers. This is a trough that we drain whenever we need to move it. The girls set it up, they'll put the spigot on and make sure there's enough pressure to fill up the tank before they leave. And then it's set up so that the cows have access to the paddock that they're moved into the following day, so that they don't have to reset a fence or anything like that. So it's super convenient to do it that way as well. As I had mentioned earlier, this is basically my #1 target for this pasture project, and that is to aim for a minimum of 75 days rest before we move those animals into a paddock to be grazed again within a grazing season or within the next grazing season. So that 75 days rest is actually the active growing season. So if we get a hard killing frost, the growing season is over. And if those plants aren't at a 3-leaf stage, which I will talk about shortly here, that is still considered, not considered part of the active growing season. So we've got really good positive results with regards to having that minimum days rest before the animals will go back into that paddock. Certainly, if we do have a really good early growing season, we'll just move those animals through quickly and just clip the top of the plants, because we have got caught kind of with our pants down where the paddocks got ahead of us, and we actually had to make hay in a couple of the paddocks because it was getting too mature. So we never want to be in that situation again. And so, we're monitoring those paddocks on a weekly basis, on a daily basis in some cases. I don't actually work near the station, so I do drive here once a week to look at the pastures. But it's certainly something that is a necessity in terms of pasture management. So in terms of the plant readiness, again, this is some of the work that Kathy Voth did down in the US, and she's written several papers in terms of when is the plant ready to be grazed. And her research has basically suggested that you look at the majority of the grasses within your pasture, and it's got to be the grasses being at that 3-leaf collared stage. So certainly neither one of these plants would be acceptable to be putting the animals on. But if you had looked at the pasture at this point in time, it looked nice and green, and it was definitely, people are wanting to get their cows out to pasture after feeding them the whole entire winter. So it's something that you definitely, have to reserve from doing because you don't want to put them out there too early. You want to make sure that they're at that 3-leaf stage, the 3-leaf collared stage, and then you will be able to have taken advantage of the grasses having the capability to withstand the grazing pressure and the ability to go through photosynthesis and be able to put those carbohydrate root reserves back into the roots, ensuring that plant remains healthy and productive. Again, these are some of the other grasses that we monitor. So we monitor them on a weekly basis starting in May. And yeah, what we're also finding here is that definitely on the continuous side of things, the grasses are shorter, the grasses are less productive, they're slower to start back up in the spring. So yeah, I think you can probably guess on which side you want your cows to be on in terms of this project, either the continuous or the planned grazing. And the other thing is the residual management. Certainly you can see on the planned side, we have a lot of dead material that was left from the year prior, and it's certainly helping with the increase in organic matter and increasing the resilience to those extreme climatic conditions that may occur. So if we do get spring flooding, these are definitely more resilient. They have a stronger root system. They have more plant material there to be able to withstand something like a spring flood. Again, we're just monitoring. We drive through these paddocks every week on a weekly basis until we feel that the majority of the grasses within those pastures are at the 3-leaf collard stage. So just exemplifying that in this picture again, and how important we find that this is a good practice to follow. The other little trick that we've learned is mineral placement. Many of you may already be doing this, but there's many producers that I talk to that typically like to place that mineral right beside a watering hole or wherever the water location might be, because it's an easier way of checking their cows. We use it in the opposite regard, where if this was more so on the continuous pastures, where we only had 2 watering sites, one at one end and one at the other. And we wanted to get a little bit better utilization of those pastures to be able to keep the cows out there a little bit longer. So we weren't following a true protocol in terms of a continuous pasture system where, a cattle producer would put them out there in May and, come and collect them at the end of September or October, or whenever the first killing frost might be. We wanted to get good utilization across our pastures. And as we went through the past 6 years, we've learned where the cows really liked having their favorite grazing places. And so, and then there were other parts that were underutilized. And so moving these mineral feeders was just an excellent way of being able to manipulate and entice those cows to go where we really wanted them to go. It's really an effective tool to be able to utilize pastures better, especially if you have something like a long, narrow paddock. Placing the water at one end and the mineral feeder at the other definitely increases the utilization of the forages by the animals. And then residual management. These are the grazing cages that we have placed in all of the paddocks to do a peak yield at the beginning of July on all of the paddocks, and we move them every year so that they're not manipulated by grazing around the cages, etc. But again, we do the peak yield assessment as well. But what we're finding is definitely where we have lots more residue, we are seeing a lot more healthier grasses, less weed infestations. The weed infestations are definitely becoming a problem on the continuous pasture. And this is only after 6 years of continuous grazing. And, a lot of bare ground, a lot of exposure to, heat and hotter temperatures for the soil microbes. We're actually seeing a lot of undesirable species. We're seeing even, things like the Richardson ground squirrel or moles moving in. So yeah, it's becoming a pasture, or it was becoming a pasture that, was undesirable for any producer. So it only took us 6 years to get to that point where, if you're not going to do something, there's no turning back. It's going to be a very unproductive pasture. And, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. So during this project, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We've done a lot of assessments based on pictures, taking pictures in the same spot over the years and just seeing the ramifications of how management by a producer, more so than the animals, is actually having an effect. So I'm standing at the fence line and basically just did turned around and took a picture on one side versus the other. And by September, usually by the end of August, beginning of September, we were always pulling the cows on the continuous pastures. And you can see, what those pastures look like compared to the ones on the planned side where we were moving them every day and allowing them access to an acre a day. So they did graze it down a little bit harder for a very short period of time, but again, they were allowed that those species within those pastures were allowed adequate days rest and recovery, and this was the result. Whereas that continuous pasture keeps getting hammered and, you know, it just has no opportunity to rest and recover. And we also take residual measurements at the end of each season as well in all of the paddocks. So we do a lot of measurements on these pastures. You can see on the continuous side, you know, it's easy to see our 1/4 meter square here, and what are we to sample? In some cases, you know, the measurement was 0. We basically clipped down to an inch above ground. And in some cases, there was 0 residual, and these were random spots where we would pick the measurements. And then, you know, again, on the other side of the fence, you can see that it's really hard to see the 1/4 meter squared in here, but we would fill up our sampling bag full at the end of the season based on you know, our good management principles. So we've certainly seen a lot of great results in terms of the forage productivity from the management perspective. And this is just a, you know, a brief overview of over the years, 2019, the last 3 years anyway, with regards to our forage productivity. And in some cases, you know, we're getting equivalent growth, but there are exceptions to many of these paddocks. We've certainly didn't seed down everything. There was some native paddocks in there. There was some wetland areas. So we're certainly seeing different results, but overall, the productivity is definitely more on the planned side of things. And, you know, it was going down on the continuous side. The other thing was that we've had 3 years of dry conditions. I think that once we get some adequate moisture again, we'll see more significant differences in terms of the productivity on those healthier plants. I think they will be able to rebound faster, and we'll be able to see, you know, higher yields on the planned grazing. We were under a lot of drought stress over the last couple of seasons, so it's been challenging at times, but overall, I think we're doing a great job. One of the other things I wanted to mention that I didn't mention earlier, and that was, I'm just going to go back to my earlier slide here on the grazing systems. So most of this, the A and B paddocks and the E paddocks were all seeded down to a tame grass mixture. And the G paddocks were actually seeded down to Sicer milk vetch pasture. And in those G paddocks, which was exemplified in this picture here, you can see that we still have plenty of Sicer milk vetch in that pasture. Whereas here, the Sicer milk vetch had almost 0 resilience to grazing pressure. So we have seen phenomenal differences in terms of species identity on much of the continuous pasture versus the planned grazing. So on the planned grazing, we have been able to maintain the species that were initially planted there. On some of the native undisturbed areas, we are actually seeing an increase in some of the things like big blue stem, and some of those species. So a lot of the native species are actually starting to creep in, which is really phenomenal to see. So we're pretty excited about that through rest and recovery, we're getting a lot more diversity on the planned grazing. And then I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about some cowboy math here, and just with regards to how we are sort of itemizing this in terms of the financial aspect of it. So basically what we did was just a simplified version of how we saw, you know, an increase in profit with regards to this grazing practice. And basically what we were saying is that at the end of each season, we were getting, and it was over the 6 consecutive years of, you know, several extra days grazing in the fall, where we had to pull the continuous cows off and those planned cows generally got a month more of grazing every year, either in the spring where they could go out earlier, a week or two earlier, or 4 to 6 weeks later in the fall. So we've seen significant impact in terms of grazing days, which obviously is a feed cost savings at the end of the season, where you're not having to find a winter feed supply for those cows or put them into a pen and feed them and paying yardage and such. So we've calculated that into here. And the other aspect is that those calves on those cows are, actually putting extra pounds on as well. So, in some of these cases, we'll take the average sale of a calf that fall and put it in here in terms of how we calculated the profit sales. So, for example, in year one, those cow-calf pairs were out there for 41 extra days. And in that case, the calves had gained an extra 88 pounds in those 41 days extra on pasture. So significant, potential profit there in terms of extra money in your pocket. And we basically did that over the years and found that with each year and having those extra days grazing was absolutely a extra way of increasing the profitability of this operation and the resiliency and the productivity. So, all in all, we found very good results. We didn't see a lot of change in terms of the differences between the cow productivity, because certainly we were pushing those cow-calf pairs on the planned grazing. They didn't get a choice as to what they wanted to graze. They were only allowed the 1 acre. So, they had to either fight or flight, basically. But overall, productivity was the same in terms of pounds of gain on the animals. We didn't see significant differences in terms of herd health or in fertility. So overall, basically we were focused on the forage and the landscape and the species within the forage mixtures, and the day's rest, I think, was basically sort of our overall goal. And I think we've achieved that in more ways than one. So that sort of wraps up my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Pam. That was a great talk, and it's so interesting to hear what you guys are working on at the Manitoba Beef and Forage Institute. Is the I Institute?
Initiatives.
Initiative, thank you. MBFI, I always see the acronym. So yeah, it's great to hear what you guys are working on out there. So everyone, if you've got questions for Pam, please throw them in the chat. I've got a few that have come in already to get us started. So first of all, how did you guys decide where to put the fences on the Brookdale farm? Or sort of what factors should a producer that's switching from continuous to planned or rotational grazing, what sort of factors should they think about for where to put those fences?
So we actually inherited the farm, and so there was some existing fences that we were working with there already. And we didn't have any preconceived notions as to what a fence should look like. So I guess a lot of farmers like to have straight fences, and certainly along the highway, yeah, that was definitely an issue. We wanted it to make it look good. But for the most part, we worked our way around sloughs. We worked our way around, bush and, just the overall terrain. It's a little bit of rolling topography there in some areas. And we just kind of really focused on the paper more than anything. Just as to how we would develop the grazing systems so that they would be equal to each other. So Dr. McGonigal and I spent a few hours discussing how this could, transpire, and then how we would develop the project so that we could compare apples to apples. Again, it's not that, I needed to have straight fences, or that, we were working more with the topography and the geography of the landscape. It wasn't really, where to put the fences. It was just having, the equitability of both of the grazing systems. And I think that's a big part of pasture planning, is to work around bush, or to try to save some of the good aspects of your pastures and look at how you can improve, poorer areas.
Thanks. You mentioned that in the rotational grazing systems, you were trying to avoid making hay from surplus plus growth. So what is wrong with making hay in pastures that have that extra growth? Or why are you guys trying to avoid that?
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's bad in any way. It's just that it got ahead of us that one year and it caught us off guard. Like we never thought that, and we had a lot of moisture that year. We haven't run into that since because it's just got drier and drier and drier every year. And maybe that is an opportunity, you know, like I say, the increased production is definitely a bonus. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying we got caught with, you know, having too much forage with the herd size that we had. And yeah, we had lots of forage that year come winter to be able to feed out on to the cows that were there.
Thanks for the clarification. You talked about getting good utilization or improving the utilization of your pasture by where you place your water, your fencing, your mineral. What % utilization are you targeting? Like what are you qualifying as good? What's
Great
the target?
question. Great question. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. So we target 50% utilization is what we're targeting. And it's basically more of an art than a science. And so, you know, we're training ourselves to figure, okay, this is what was there. You know, we take the measurements, but it's really hard to really say, okay, did we take 40 or did we take 50 or did we take 60 this time? So yeah, it's more of an art than a science, but that's definitely a great question. And I forgot to mention that as well.
Have you looked into clipping pastures after taking the cows off, say to like 6 inches height?
We have not. Well, we haven't had to worry about that on the continuous side of things for sure, because many of those are down to less than an inch in some case. Like it was getting pretty bad there in this last couple of years with the drought. But no, I'd rather leave the residue there. I don't think it's a bad thing to leave the residue there by any means. It traps a lot of moisture and traps a lot of snow for spring moisture, and just, you know, giving us peace of mind that we'll have enough moisture for that boost of growth in the spring.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth bearing in mind too. I mean, the farm that you guys are working on is in a drier climate even than our northwestern districts. So trapping moisture is huge for you, and that residual is really, really important. Whereas for us further east, we're getting up consistently more rainfall. How we approach that residual may be slightly different just because of climate differences. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So leading into that, because there are these climate differences and stuff, would your 75 to 90-day rest change if you had, I guess, 2 parts, more normal rainfall for you because your last few years have been dry, or just more rainfall in general, to kind of bring this into an Ontario context?
I think we probably would look at things like increasing our herds. I think if we have adequate moisture like we did in year 1 and the forage got ahead of us, we have had good years like that. There's no doubt about it, where, you know, forage productivity is overwhelming at times, and it's very difficult to put up good quality hay that's dry. And a lot of our producers have moved to silage production in that case, where, you know, they couldn't get it up dry, and now that it's dry, you know, they've moved to a silage based system, and, you know, they're no longer putting up dry hay. But anyway, yeah, I think there'd be 2 opportunities there. Certainly, you know, looking at more silage production, as I mentioned, and or looking at increasing the herd size, grazing faster, making smaller paddocks so that you could, you know, maybe move them twice a day, for example. In a 1 acre paddock, we could move them quicker in the spring so that we can keep up to that regrowth, or that forage growth faster in the spring. That's faster in the spring. There's a little bit more opportunity to play with it. And that's the thing about planned grazing. It's just a plan, and that you can change it at any point in time. And you're well prepared in terms of your mindset as to how you can do that. You're not trapped in a corner and saying, oh my God, like I have nothing, I have no choice now, but, you know, in a dry year, we have to sell off the herd. We haven't had to do that at all. It wasn't even, that path didn't even, you know, we didn't even cross that path because we didn't have to. we were always ahead of the game in terms of planning.
Thanks. Are you using any fertilizer on your pastures? And if so, what is that fertilizer plan?
No, the answer is no, we have not. And, you know, we always talk about fertilization and maintaining the forage stand. And it's really going against everything that I have, you know, talked about in my extension career, but that was based on conventional practices. And so that was on those continuous pastures, which require a lot more fertilizer. That was on pastures that producers are not practicing good rotational grazing. We have not had to do that, and we have had really good success. And I think that's in part to, you know, having a good soil microbial population there that is doing a lot of that for us. So, and the fact is, you know, they're on small paddocks, and the cows are recycling those nutrients for us. The urine and the dung is staying within that paddock, you know, because they're only on 1 acre. There's 50 head there that are doing the fertility for us. So yeah.
Yeah, it's much more even manure distribution when they're on such a small space for a short time compared to a continuous system too. So that makes a difference with the nutrient cycling. Sicer milk vetch. It's a legume we don't grow a lot of, possibly none of in Ontario, but it does seem to be kind of dominant in some of those pastures that you showed us. Was that a choice? Was it seeded on purpose, or was it something that comes up in native pasture?
No, it was seeded on purpose. Ducks Unlimited used to own this farm, and so they had seeded down some Sicer milk vetch to see its applicability here in Manitoba, and it certainly has grown in terms of its popularity on many of the pastures. The one thing about Sicer milk vetch is it is very resilient under good grazing management. And yeah, what we're seeing is on some of the paddocks where there was no Sicer milk vetch planted, we're getting Sicer milk vetch because we're allowing that, you know, that rest and recovery opportunity. And so the seed is able to germinate on some of those. The cows are bringing it with them through their manure or whatever when they, you know, ingest a seed head. So we're seeing a lot more Sicer milk vetch throughout the pastures, even on some of the paddocks that, you know, have remained untouched. We're seeing Sicer milk vetch in the paddocks. So definitely the cows are spreading it for us. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a problem or not. Like, it's a legume, so it's able to fix nitrogen. So, you know, but if it's going to take over pastures, is it going to be a problem? Not sure yet. But yeah, I would suggest two things about Sicer. If it's in a continuous grazing system, don't even bother planting it, because obviously you can see it dies out within, well, after year 3, it was basically gone. And then, you know, if you're worried about having it overtake your pastures, yeah, it might be a problem. But again, it's a legume. Once it's established and you've got that good grazing management, I think it's an opportunity for nitrogen fixation. And we all know what fertilizer prices are doing right now. So
yeah, absolutely. Is there anything used for pest control? I don't know if that's weeds or if that's the gophers that you mentioned. Let's go with weeds. Are you doing anything for weed control?
We are not at this point in time. So our proposed plan for this upcoming grazing season is to actually take the continuous pastures and put them into a planned grazing system. So we're going to look at doing some high intensity grazing on those and, you know, make them into small paddocks, graze for a day and then move them on and have that 75 to 90 day rest again in those pastures, and see if we can utilize the livestock to do the recourse action. So we want to try to use them to be our tools to try to get it back to where it was. I know it's going to take a lot longer, but we just don't want to disturb the landscape in terms of tillage and seeding and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's weeds there, but we're hoping that if we have effective grazing management that we can maybe choke them out. I mean, that's what we're seeing on some of the other paddocks that were totally infested with weeds. They're slowly coming back. You know, we're seeing things like clovers coming in. and some, better grasses rather than just a Kentucky bluegrass, for example. So we are seeing some succession.
I've got some clarification. By pests, Chris meant flies. Are you doing anything for fly control?
Actually, we just did a trial last year with using the garlic-based mineral, but that was only for research purposes. It wasn't really for fly control per se. We really don't seem to have a lot of fly issues. The cows are moving so fast through the pastures that it's not really an issue, although they do put Ivomec on them once a year for other issues, but not really necessarily flies.
Okay. Given that grass plants typically start to regrow in 4 to 5 days after a grazing or cutting event, and it can be difficult for farmers to have the labor to move cattle every day, could it make sense to increase paddock size? So you guys are working on 1 acre, so maybe 1.5 acres, 2 1/4 acres, and extend the grazing time, the time that they're in those paddocks, to 2 to 3 days. Would that create any issues, or do you see that possibly creating
Nope,
issues?
I don't think so. I mean, we were doing it on a small scale. I've got producers who are working on a quarter section basis, right? So they've got 600 cows and they're moving them, every couple of days onto a new quarter. So same sort of premise, where it depends on your herd size and what the dry matter intake requirements are for the amount of animals that you have and how much forage productivity is on that specific size of land. So it's all based on those specifications. We're just showcasing this on a small scale. Absolutely. And yeah, I have lots of producers that I'm working with who are, they're in that same boat where they don't have the manpower. So yeah, they'll move them every 2 or 3 days, but there's still enough paddocks to allow that those cows won't come back to that specific area for the 70 days or 60 days or whatever it might be.
Thanks. What are the most common grass species in the rotationally grazed paddocks?
We have everything from timothy, smooth brome, meadow brome. We've got a little bit of alfalfa, Sicer milk vetch. It was a very diverse mixture. We wanted not to put all our eggs in one basket, so we tried to cover all our bases with, and there's a lot of clover coming in, actually, wild, like white clovers coming in, sweet clovers coming in. So yeah, it's definitely diverse, and that's something that I often make reference to when I'm doing forage species recommendations for guys who are trying to renovate. And a lot of the seed companies are moving to species within or varieties within a species. So, a mixture will have 2 or 3 different varieties of alfalfa in a species. So yeah, I think the more diverse, the less risk there is.
Did any of those mixtures contain warm season grasses?
No, but they're coming in on their own. Like I say, we're getting lots of big blue stem and green needle grass. We're getting some of those type of species coming in, which is, we've got purple prairie clover coming in. There's a big patch of purple prairie clover that's coming in there. So we are seeing a lot of native species starting to creep in, which is just, it's like, I'm elated because they typically take so long to if it's been disturbed, which most of this land has been, it's really invigorating to see some of those species come on their own.
So aside from that initial seeding where you planted those diverse mixes to get the project going, have you done any no-till pasture renovation to help improve anything since?
We haven't at this farm. At our other farm, which is closer to Brandon, they have been doing some of that no-till drill. They've been doing some sod and mob seeding. So yeah, not at this specific site, but at the other site. Some of my coworkers have worked on that, on their research.
Good results, bad results?
Promising results, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, no, they've definitely had some good results with regard to the zero-till seeding, and required fertility but again, it's a drier area, much sandier than this specific site. So they're having to contend with a lot harsher conditions to get those forages established to begin with. So, but they are getting promising results. And that was just basically with some legumes into a grass stand is what they were trying to do, putting in alfalfa. And yeah, after year 1, you could definitely see the alfalfa coming through, and it's still there after year 3. So yeah, definitely promising results.
Good stuff. You talked a bit about measuring how much residual you're leaving at the end of the grazing season when you're closing those paddocks and taking the cattle out. What is your target? How much residual are you leaving when you're closing those paddocks for the winter, or trying to leave?
We don't actually have a target. Like I say, we're trying to utilize 50%. So we'd like to see 50% left in the paddocks. That doesn't always, there's no perfect grazing management there in terms of what we leave, but we just want to have a good, adequate cover more than anything. We don't want to see any bare spots. We don't want to see any bare ground for we're really worried about spring flooding. We did experience some in one spring where we had a significant rainfall, but it didn't impact the pastures at all because our pastures were really, had a good stronghold in terms of root capacity. And so it really didn't do a lot of damage to the pastures when it was that wet spring. But yeah, like I say, we're trying to graze 50% and leave 50%. It's not always the case, but based on climatic conditions, but that's our overall goal. And we do have measurements with regard to the residual, and we do a spring measurement as well before the cows go out on the pastures, just to see what's there in terms of new growth. I didn't include that in there for the sake of time tonight, but we do have those measurements as well.
Thanks. Have you tried feeding seed to the cows in loose mineral to reseed the paddocks? Is that part of the project?
I cannot say we have, no.
Fair enough. When we're talking about planned grazing, like you said, you have a plan and then you adjust based on what the year throws at you. So if you were planning to rotate every 3 days and there's still feed in the paddock that they're in, do you rotate because you're on day 3 according to your plan, or do you wait until the pasture is ready, you've grazed it down to your target, and then move them?
It depends on what's ahead of us, and it also depends on what the climatic conditions are. So we have made adjustments where, for example, this year was really, really dry. So we actually held the cattle back and increased the utilization, for example, in one of the paddocks. So we didn't get the residual that we wanted there, but we knew that we might run short later on. So we held them back in a couple of paddocks to get an extra day or 2 grazing in certain conditions. So it's not really based on the calendar at all. It's based on how much utilization is there when they're going to be moved. It's based on what things look like ahead of them. It's just a plan, and we do not stick to that. And in the plan, typically we'll say, okay, they'll go to these paddocks first, and then the next they'll go to the A paddocks, and then they'll go to the G paddocks, and then they'll go to the B paddocks. But if the B paddocks aren't ready and the E paddocks are, we absolutely will move them to the E paddocks if they fall within the 75-day rest period. And that was one mistake I did make in my first year of doing this. I went in terms of consecutive order. So I went from the A paddocks to the B paddocks to the C paddocks to the D paddocks to the E paddocks. So big mistake on my part in terms of, okay, well, I'm doing a great job because I'm moving them every day, but those paddocks weren't necessarily ready to be grazed. And, the other thing that I had a mentor that was helping me who had many, many years of experience with planned grazing. And so he was helping me in the first couple of years. And he basically gave me a really good word of advice, and that was never to start in the same order that you did the year before. And so you kind of have to plan when you're planning for year one, you also have to plan for year two at the same time, so that if you've started in the bee paddocks in year one, you do not start in the bee paddocks in year two. You have already planned that out in year one, where you're going to start in the D paddocks in the following year. So you have to leave those D paddocks at the end of the season so that they've had 75 days rest.
Thank you. All right, I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. So because you're using larger paddocks and subdividing them with a temporary fence, are you using a back fence after each move to keep them from going back to graze where they've been? You are, okay.
I do. That's just my personal preference. I know a lot of producers who don't, because the cows typically won't go back there because it's already grazed. But I like leaving that 50% untouched so that we get good regrowth. It's just a personal preference more than anything.
All right.
You have 3 fences set up.
So back fence, a front fence, and a leading fence?
Yeah, because that way the summer students can just open a gate and let them into the next paddock and then take that back fence down.
They learn so fast that they're moving and they're right waiting for you. So yeah, having that lead fence, a lead fence set up helps keep them getting out ahead of you.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, we're only using 1 wire, and the calves sneak under it as well, which is not a problem because they get, they're able to select some of the higher quality. I don't have a problem with the calves sneaking under the fence, and that way that other fence, does provide a little bit more resistance to them moving forward where there is no more fence, right? So yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much, Pam. And thank you to our attendees tonight. You guys posed some fantastic questions. I'm going to hand things back to Terry now to close it up and finish off our session tonight. So Terry, take it away.
Great. That was excellent, Pam. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing some of your expertise with us today. That is much appreciated. Thanks again to our sponsors for their support of these webinars: Beef Farmers of Ontario, Ontario Sheep Farmers, Minto Ag Limited, and SGS Canada Laboratories. Thank you for your support in helping us to host this event.